In previous video, we discussed the dynamics of mirroring and protection in a narcissistic codependent relationship. And in this video, we want to concentrate on the mirroring and projection in a relationship between two recovering codependents who have broken free from their respective previous narcissistic relationships and now have found each other. There are different ways and steps to take when it comes to recovering from narcissistic abuse, and what is beneficial for one person might not be as beneficial for others. It's a matter of finding a way that works for the individual, and this is where life coaches come in handy. There are many of them out there, and of course it's a quality mix, but it pays off to check out quite a few of them in order to find your own approach to healing. Fact remains that the soul, mind, body, because they are one and the same on a metaphysical level, get fragmented when facing trauma, and these fragments need to be healed in order for the soul, mind, body complex to be whole again. Not until then can we be comfortably in present time and create our lives in a completely conscious state of mind. Healing and reintegration can be done on our own with various degrees of success, or it can be done by two people who are mirroring each other. Ariel and I have done both, and we have found that the absolute fastest and most effective way to heal is between two codependents that have gained enough trust and safety with each other to be able to open up and share their emotions, vulnerabilities, and insecurities. This kind of healing can be very intense, particularly at first, but if both parties are willing to live through this often painful emotional phase, the gains from mirroring are remarkable. I can speak from first-hand experience because I am doing this with Ariel. Now it so happens that she and I are very much alike. So alike that I would even suggest that we are twin flames, which makes it even more intense, making the results even more remarkable. However, two codependents do not need to be soulmates or twin flames for this to work. What needs to be established first, nonetheless, is trust and safety. Without these two components, healing will not happen because the partners don't dare to be authentic with each other. No one is willing to open up because codependents are used to being attacked or ridiculed when they show their vulnerabilities, so they muzzle up. A relationship between two codependents, which might be in a love relationship or a friend relationship, can be quite tumultuous if the parties don't know much about narcissistic abuse, because both persons have a tendency to unintentionally trigger each other. Narcs are narcs, and they have their set of patterns to traumatize their targets. Therefore, the wounds of two codependents are often very similar. In such a relationship, and more so in the beginning, both persons might feel almost constantly triggered by the other because they mirror each other. One person might say something that is typical for a codependent to say in a narc relationship without thinking about it, and the other person gets triggered, often without understanding why he or she gets triggered. Because two codependents tend to trigger each other, a love relationship between two codependents often leads to that they separate, at least if they don't understand the dynamic in the relationship. They think that they are not compatible, so they leave and go back into a relationship with a narcissist again. This has to do with that both codependents are very insecure and they are used to a partner that takes charge, like often is the case in a narcissistic relationship. Thus, a codependent has a very hard time keeping any kind of love relationship unless both parties are willing to heal. Another phenomenon that might sound familiar is when you meet a person at work, or anywhere else for that matter, and you really like that person, but the communication between the two of you is forced and doesn't take off. You might feel nervous and anxious. You might feel it's your fault because you are so insecure, but in fact both of you are insecure, and there is nothing wrong with either of you. Both of you just happen to trigger each other, sometimes just by each other's presence. On the other hand, when you meet a person who is relatively integrated, you notice that the conversation might flow quite well. It requires patience and resilience in order to break through these first uncomfortable barriers. However, once that is done, healing will begin in a rapid pace, taking into consideration that the two know what they're up against. It's their own subconscious mind that needs healing. And what comes up to the surface is usually what needs to be healed and reintegrated first. Another interesting phenomenon might occur between two codependents, particularly so between two twin flames. Sometimes they just need to sit alone in the same room for one or both to be triggered, and when this happens, it can be quite intense. One or both might feel the urge to leave the room and just withdraw to a place where they can be alone, and this is when the great test begins. If you experience this, don't follow this urge. Instead, stay in the same room, even when it feels emotionally triggering, and ride it out. And tell each other before or after such a situation occurs that it is perfectly okay to just sit there in silence if you're too triggered to talk, and just wait it out. It might take a while to go through this, and if it gets too intense, you can both agree that it's enough for that time, and you might both get some space from each other, but don't leave the room without such an agreement, because it triggers the other person's abandonment anxiety, and it also makes the person who leaves feel bad that he or she couldn't get through it. Next day, the two codependents might get along just fine, and the communication flows, only to find themselves in the first situation again all of a sudden. Again, go through it, because it will get easier. After a while, both persons might notice that their emotional traumas that triggered the uncomfortable situations will discharge, and it gets easier and easier, although in fact not a word might have been spoken. My case in point is that reintegration and healing can take place by just sitting there, mirroring each other, while energies bounce back and forth between the two, until they discharge, and the fragment or fragments reintegrate. This can be extremely therapeutic. Ariel and I call this silent mirroring. What usually happens during these silent mirroring sessions is that both persons will have their deepest fears triggered, and the inner critic will start his or her inner monologue. See video 7 to learn more about the inner critic. Each participant might think something in line with, "I'm not good enough for her or him, and I will be abandoned," or "How can this person like or love me when I am this secluded?" Or "I can't even have a normal conversation," or "This is how it's always going to be between us. I will never overcome this, and he or she will get tired of me being this way. This is the story of my life." It doesn't even matter that the other person is acting in the same manner. The inner critic often doesn't recognize this. However, silent mirroring alone will not do it, although it's a very powerful tool to integrate fragments without having to do much cognitive processing. Still, this has to be combined with other processes. Communication is an extremely important part of healing, although it sounds like we're contradicting ourselves by saying this, in contrast to a silent mirroring. Codependents carry so much guilt and shame inside that it can be very difficult to open up, even when trust and safety are established. Thus, sharing insecurities and vulnerabilities is therefore best to be done in increments, little by little. If one person opens up, the other will usually soon follow, and both parties will open up more and more as time goes by. When a person opens up, don't interrupt. Let that person talk about their trigger and wound as much as they feel necessary. Just sit there and be present. Listen and attend to what the other person is telling you, without judgment or opinions. When the person is finished, don't try to resolve the issue. Instead, acknowledge what the person just said and indicate that under the circumstance, it's very appropriate to feel this way. This is very important. Even if a person told you about something that happened just a few weeks ago, the bottom of the wound is always anchored in the childhood. So in essence, you are listening to that person's inner child, who was the first part of him or her who experienced this trauma. It usually all goes back to childhood. Traumatic incidents over time attach to each other in chains. This means that there is normally an earlier similar incident that is hidden in the subconscious, blocked by the more recent incidents, where the person's focus usually is located because it's closer in time. Hence, it's important to ask the person if there is an earlier similar incident. When the person finds it, he or she communicates it to the listener. In this manner, we go back in time and find earlier and earlier incidents until we find the first one on the chain. When this happens, the person often feels a great relief and brightens up and can even feel ecstatic and happy. Then it's time to stop. This particular chain is now reintegrated and the person is a little closer to becoming whole again. When new triggers surface, we repeat the same procedure. Sometimes a chain can be long and it might take time to go through it. If so, and time doesn't allow you to complete the entire process, make sure you pause at a good point and not in the middle of an incident. Then continue when time allows, but don't let too much time pass between the sessions. It's very important. Another important thing is that when a person hits an incident, he or she shouldn't go back in time to process it. Instead, the person brings the incident up to present time and looks at it from that perspective. Reintegration must take place in the present. You don't go back and reintegrate in the past. The above is a general overview of how reintegration can take place. Ariel and I have found Teal Swan's completion process helpful, and it explains much more in detail how to do it on ourselves or with a partner. We suggest you check out her YouTube channel and search for completion process and fragmentation. We strongly suggest you get familiar with the procedure before you start using it. It won't harm to do it anyway, but to get the best results in whatever we do in life, we need to educate ourselves on the subject first. From understanding how the human mind works, it becomes more obvious why the completion process and similar processes work. A very nice thing when twinning up with a partner is that when one person heals, the other person tends to heal as well, without having to go through the same thing. Because the partners are mirroring each other, they also tend to discharge the same things at the same time. This does not always happen, but we have found this very common in our own relationship, and some life coaches have noticed this phenomenon too. Sometimes, because both parties are triggered, they might react in a similar manner as they did with their narcs. So they might project their own pain on the other person and start accusing the other for their own issues. This doesn't happen between all partners, but one might want to be prepared for it and be aware of what it is. When this happens, both persons sit down, usually afterwards, and discuss it and reintegrate whatever it was that got triggered. The most important thing, perhaps, is that the partners accept each other exactly the way they are and are willing to take the other one as a part of themselves and embrace the other person. By now we understand that whatever the other person tells us is just wounds and that need to be healed, that's all. To me and Ariel, it is of no consequence what comes up. The deeper stuff, the better. And you will notice that the more the person tells you about themselves and their vulnerabilities, the more you will love him or her, because you come closer and closer, the more you understand each other. The details, whatever they might be, are irrelevant in this case. We know that the more shame and guilt the other person feels and is willing to express, the more healing takes place. Finally, here's another important thing. People who have been subjected to narc abuse usually want to educate themselves and get validation for their situation. This is normal and encouraged. But this is the easier part. The difficult part is to start looking within ourselves and accept what we find and be willing to confront and reintegrate it. Therefore, many people continue, year after year in some cases, just learning more and more about narcissism without looking inward. They subconsciously try to avoid the inner work. It's important at one point to override this barrier and start doing the work where no real healing will take place. People hear and read about others who have gone through the same trauma, and it feels good not to be alone. However, it's one thing to look at the outside mirror, i.e. what we learn from others, and another thing to turn the mirror inside and look at our own need for healing. It's very important that we do both.